So I'd like to ask him to throw some light into the back agreement, the EOE laws as well as the UCITRA law, possibly bearing in mind the different jurisdictions, if you allow me. I mean, in Britain we have the common law, here we have the civil procedural law, which is based on the French law, essentially. So we'd like to have some light thrown into these matters. Thank you.
I think certainly the back-to-back contracts out here can cause difficulties, especially for smaller subcontractors or when the market's difficult and people are very keen to sign up to documents. Referring to the FIDIC subcontract, it's often the case that that sort of contract or subcontracts generally include pay when paid clauses. Now those, for example, they're illegal in many jurisdictions on the basis that it tends to end up with subcontractors carrying the cash flow risk of the whole project. Out here you quite often see them, and in many respects that's a way that main contractors try to get around the problem that Ian was talking about earlier of having to run many arbitrations. If you don't owe anything downstream to your subcontractors until you've been paid upstream, you don't really mind, you can just keep them waiting until you've sorted out your arbitration and then worry about them later. And I think that back-to-back basis is often a problem. It's often used as very much a shortcut. People want to get their subcontractors on board straight away so they can start working, get things ordered. And so you just sort of see clauses saying things like, you know, the main contract applies mutatis mutandis, which means everything from the main contract flows down to the subcontract. Now, that doesn't work if either you're a main contractor or a subcontractor usually, because it simply isn't the case that the subcontractor should take the same levels of risk as a main contractor. For a start, it means if you're a main contractor, you'll be getting a much higher price than you should be getting, because why should the subcontractor take the same level of risk? So I think the back-to-back contracts, they work in principle, and as a main contractor, you need them to be there, because you need to make sure that everything that the subcontractor is doing for you is flowed down. But you have to be very careful about how they're drafted. You cannot just take a one-size-fits-all blanket approach. You'd have to go through very much every clause, make sure it works, and make sure it fits. And pay-when-paid clauses are something that would need particular attention if you're on the supplier-subcontractor side. For example, in the UK, which is where I come from, there's a highly specialised body of jurisdiction and indeed a particular court that these matters go to. And since that court came into force, a lot more matters went that way rather than down the ADR. You can guarantee that you'll get someone to hear your case that has got specialised and technical knowledge to deal with it. Out here, that's not necessarily the case, which makes arbitration a very appealing thing, because you can make sure you pick the right people to deal with your matter. So I think out here, there's still a lot of way to go to get the laws into the right sort of form so that people can rely more on the underlying contracts. I know that there is a move afoot to set up construction courts in Abu Dhabi. I'm for one not quite sure where that's at. It was announced last year, and I think they're still moving towards it, and I think that will be a welcome change when it does arrive.
So I'll just say a few words about the trial model law. As Dr. Imad said, it's if you like, it's a template law that was prepared by the United Nations Commission on International Trade, and is designed to be a law that any country can adopt as its own arbitration law. Now, so far, I think there's about 40 different countries all across the world that have adopted it. Some of them have adopted it without any amendment at all. Some of the countries have made some minor amendments to it. So, for example, if you went to Peru and you looked at the Peruvian arbitration law, you would in fact recognise that as the UNCITRAL model law with just a few minor amendments. Similarly, if you went to Nigeria and looked at the Nigerian arbitration law, again you'd recognise that as the same model law with just a few amendments. And I think the most recent adoption was in fact in Scotland last year, where they adopted the model law with some amendments. Now, the UAE for some considerable time has been looking at the adoption of the model law here. Of course, the very difficult question that you face is to what extent do you make amendments to that law to fit in with the local legal system, the local culture, the local ways of doing business. And that's the very fine balancing act that the government here has to deal with, because as everyone knows, it's much better to spend the time getting the law right, making sure it's going to work properly, than to bring the law in haste and then cause problems later down the track.
Thanks, Ian. I cannot but agree completely with what Ian and Amos said about this. And I may just draw the attention of the crowd, the audience, that the FIDIC was based on ICE conditions, which is a commonly based what you call jurisdiction. ICE stands for International Institute of Civil Engineering. And as you can see from the terms and conditions, there is a lot of legal phrasing there. And I think being an engineering document, we should not phase out, but at least reduce the legal complications and go into something more direct, simple English, because we're dealing with numbers and figures when we talk about engineering contracts. But unfortunately, it was, and still to a certain extent, written by or guided by what they call the legal consultants in writing these clauses, which sometimes is very difficult to explain or express, or even express in so many ways. So that really one of the causes of the problem. Necessity of really going into proper dialogue with the users of these arbitration laws. Like they prepared in what you call in citral, I would say modified, okay, copy, but I believe there is a lot of things to be really inserted into this latest one, although they spent 5 years. But unfortunately, the governments, they tend to somehow what you call a closed net when they come into issuing laws, especially in this part of the world. I think this should open the venue for what they call experts in the field, private sector, especially people who are really dealing with these problems day in, day out, in order to really put their hands into it. And because it's no point of coming up with a new law and then you have problems just coming along with it. You try to reduce, you have the law to take care and go around the problems and resolve it and try to avoid it. Now, before moving on, I will go to my colleague on the left there. Probably he can throw some light on some of the disputes, especially between minor contractors and major contractors, and hopefully we can learn something.
I don't want to call it disputes. I would say that we get dragged into disputes when we deal with main contractors. Because see, from our point of view, we have suppliers, and usually our contracts are with the installers. Installers are not necessarily the main contractors. Usually, they are the subcontractors. We sometimes face a situation where we do the contract with the main contractor, and we are not necessarily our business used to the contracts directly with the main contractor, because they have different different contracts, different what we are used to in our daily life. And also, if the main contractor happen to be doing business with the government, that also becomes a more difficult situation. Our background on how we would like our contracts to be drafted and to be executed, and because our contracts are purely a supply contract. Our responsibility ends when we supply the material according to specifications, or what we understand the specifications are, on time as agreed, either most likely on the site, or sometimes be some other location. We get dragged into difficulties when we don't operate in our comfort zone. When for example, the acceptance the acceptance of the supplied material is delayed until it is accepted at site, for example, and for conditions that we cannot control. And when the acceptance is not taken back to the origin at the factory. These are situations we are facing. We are facing some situations right now of delayed payments, which we are not really accustomed to. Usually we fulfill our contracts, we supply the material as per agreement and as per the time requirement of the project, but we don't get paid as we were expecting. That is one of the difficulties we are facing more of in the current financial situation. Other than that, we don't enter into disputes of that goes into litigation. There could be some delayed payments from maybe from the owner to the main contractor, that trickles down to us. Many a times it's not due to our shortcoming, but it's due to the dynamics of the project.